I'm Alex Steacy, and you're listening to the True North Country Comics Podcast.
Welcome to the True North Country Comics Podcast, dedicated to promote Canadian comic book creators and supporters. It's August 17th, 2020. I'm John Swinimer. If you have a comment, criticism, or question, you can contact me at john@truenorthcountrycomics.com. On this episode, I chat with Alex Steacy. The podcast is available on Apple Podcasts and Google Podcasts. Alex, who resides in British Columbia, describes his hobbies as miniatures and metalwork, and of course his passion in comics and graphic novels. His work and personality have been called playfully thoughtful, thoughtfully playful, which neatly encapsulates the depth and breadth of both his art and philosophy. His most recent works include Drainers and Purifier. So, without further ado, here's my chat with Alex Steacy. Alex Steacy, thank you very much for taking time to chat with me.
Thank you for having me.
Really appreciate it. Wanted to just start off the interview and ask about influences. I know there's so many different variety of books out there and creators, but I'm wondering if there's any one particular or a couple that influence you in your work that you do.
There's a number of them, and everybody sort of has like a little kind of squad of creators. The one that always jumps to the top of my list is Tsutomu Nihei, whose most recent works were actually just serialized on Netflix, Knights of Sidonia and Blame. But I picked up his manga, Blame, quite some time ago back in Toronto, and it was really unique because I've read a lot of comics from Japan, and this one really stood out to me because it didn't feel like all the other ones, and it has a very sort of like dark, grungy sci-fi aesthetic to it that really resonated with me, and I love his design work to pieces. It's very dense, very kind of technological, and I really, really dig that. He's one among a number of Japanese authors that I took a lot of influence from. Like I picked up on a lot of manga earlier on, like Masamune Shirow, his works, Appleseed, Dominion Tank Police, Ghost in the Shell. I'm sure there's other ones that I'm forgetting, but he did a lot of monochrome comics, and they had like incredibly striking visual style that I'm still meaning to do some studies on, because the stuff that he did with panels is just like breathtaking, even to this day. I don't think he's done much narrative stuff recently, but he's got a lot of like really, really strong stuff in his back catalog. And like should I continue or?
Yeah, I mean, if you've got more influences, that'd be great to hear about them. That's for sure.
Yeah. Okay. Just thinking here, if I can branch off. I'm actually just looking over at my at my shelf.
Sure.
I just need to check a name here. So in my interests, in my influences, you will find a sort of a trend towards, sort of, I guess, like kind of darker stuff, like in both in terms of theme and art style. I couldn't explain to you exactly why I find it so appealing, but there's Hiroaki Samura, who did Blade of the Immortal, which I believe is just done using pencils, which is like just jaw-dropping, the comps that he comes up with. It's really something. I think some of his stuff might be inked, but it's very, very moody. There's like nothing else quite like it. It's a kind of a low fantasy samurai story with a lot of like really incredible action sequences as well. But there's other more contemporary and like North American artists, like there's Gerard Way and Gabriel Ba. Their book Umbrella Academy.
Oh yes.
This is a bit of a like tonal shift because it's very goofy. This is another one that got serialized pretty recently on Netflix. It's so much fun. Like, just you have these like bizarre characters going through, these sort of weird scenarios. I think it's kind of funny. I was never particularly fond of superhero comics, like cape stuff, except when it's like a subversion or parody or something, and then
Right.
I kind of eat it up. So like Umbrella Academy was like that. Warren Ellis's Next Wave Agents of Hate is the same way. That's a really good one because he took a bunch of, I think they were canon Marvel characters and sort of like threw them together into this, goofball send up of, Marvel and comic books and cave stuff, and it's just hysterical. And I really like it. Also, really amazing artwork as well. So stuff like that, I think maybe sort of advises my kind of irreverent humor style when I pull it out.
That's a lot.
Yeah, no, I mean, I could talk about this stuff for ages.
Sure.
Like I have a shelf just packed with stuff from all over the place.
Yeah, that's cool that you have the ability to have a lot of references and influences there along the way, which is certainly something to reflect on for sure.
Mm-hmm.
I recently chatted with Jeff Ellis, who you probably know from Cloudscape Comic Society, and he mentioned you and your book Drainers. So I want to talk a little bit about that and ask you how that came about.
Oh boy, this is a work that I'm ferociously proud of. It's interesting to how it came about. So I had plans to do a lot of, comic sort of long form narrative stuff for ages, but they only ever ended up as like, plans and drafts and, pie in the sky kind of ideals. And I was always in this sort of preparation phase and sort of like gearing up for something I was going to work on. That's unfortunately it can be a really pernicious trap that artists, especially young artists, can fall into, is you just like spend forever, getting ready to make that one sort of like magnum opus thing that's going to blow everybody's doors off. And you just like don't ever get around to doing the actual full process, which is where the really valuable training comes in. And so Drainers was really important because that was the point at which I finally put my foot down. Was like, I'm completely sick of this. I have to finish something no matter what. And I decided that I would give myself carte blanche to suck as bad as possible, provided I did it, then completed it. And I achieved exactly that despite a lot of obstacles that were in my way. And I really surprised myself. I surprised and impressed myself. And that's the wisdom that I think I try to pass on to as many artists as possible. It's like, don't fuss about getting it perfect. You like just get it done, and then you can move on to the next thing and improve.
Right.
Like
Yeah.
The magnet that I had on my drawing table, I wrote the words fill pages on it, which is just like get them done. Put them out the door.
That's it.
You can develop being really good at it later, but it's just like you have to go through the whole process and start putting pages out. So as for the idea of the story itself, it's weird. A lot of my most developed out ideas start as a sketch. Just a sketch I did on a whim, and it kind of snowballs out of control. And I think that's what happened with Drainers. I think I drew a portrait of Chubb, the main character, who's just like this kind of overweight guy wearing waders and this sort of like tin pot helmet and respirator. And I came up with the nudist character as well. Like I sort of waffled on whether she was going to have some sort of supernatural quality to her or not, and it ended up being a lot more mundane than that. But it just was this like weird idea that didn't feel like anything that had been done before. And I mean, obviously, they say there's only 7 stories you can tell, but you put your own kind of spin on it.
Sure.
And it just sort of expanded out from that. Like I started doing these portraits of these characters with sort of cobbled together personal protective gear, and envisioning them working in this sort of like subterranean world as these kind of like untouchable underclass that live and work in this sort of subterranean world. And it also like it became like kind of a funny sort of thing. It's just like there's two sort of schools of thought when it comes to comics that I've been made aware of, and one is planning and the other is pantsing.
Pantsing?
Pantsing, as in by the seat of your pants. I don't
Oh,
know
okay.
if
I
you've
thought you
ever
meant pull
seen.
down someone's pants.
No,
Sorry.
no, no. Oh, it's only your own. If you've ever seen the movie Wallace and Gromit, the Wrong Trousers, there's this like sequence
Yes.
where Gromit is on top of the train and it's going at top speed and he's laying down track as fast as he can in front of it. That's what pantsing is like.
Uh,
You're always just like barely ahead of the curve. And I think both methods are perfectly valid. And sometimes you sort of like use a little of either. And I definitely did that. Like I had some major story beats, like a sort of beginning, middle, and end. And then a lot of the details in the middle I sort of filled out as I progressed through that. And I was a little bit surprised to find out that there's a number of artists that actually do it that way. Like my good friend Sam Logan, who pretty recently wrapped up his 12-year epic Sam and Fuzzy.
hmm
He would do exactly what I described, planning out the major story beats and then just making up the sort of day-to-day stuff as it goes. And doing it like that, you end up sometimes like allowing the characters to sort of really surprise you and almost act on their own. Like you sort of make yourself aware of what they're like and what their tendencies are like, and you maneuver them into a situation, and then you're like, well, what makes sense for this? And you get some surprising results. It's a lot of fun. It's almost like improvising with yourself.
Cool.
So
Good.
yeah, that was how Drainers got made and how it progressed.
Nice. And then it came to fruition. It was published by Cloudscape, and then having that under your belt, did that give you sort of the incentive to go on and do your current project, Purifier?
I started Purifier, I think, before I got Drainers published. I'd have to
Oh,
check the timeline because I got a mind like a sieve. Because I mean, my intent was always to carry on, and momentum is a powerful and extremely valuable thing. Like, I think I took a short amount of time off after Drainers. Like, I mean, I always sort of draw, but I think I got that hankering again pretty soon thereafter. Started working on Purifier, which is my current ongoing webcomic. And that one, it's following a kind of a similar like process sort of workflow as Drainers, and so much the better because it's I've learned to trust the system that I've developed, and I make alterations and tinker with how it works, but it's just like I have a book that's done and is sitting on my shelf right now that proves that the route I took achieved results, and so now I can follow that pattern again and then refine it. So I'm just actually checking when I started Purifier. It was like, yeah, first month of 2019. So
oh, okay. Yeah. For those not familiar with the title and without giving too much away, how would you describe it?
I have a sort of a short little anecdote. It's a diesel punk alt history plague epidemic in London. Kind of summarizes it. It's
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah.
yeah, it's kind of an exploration into how a barely pre antibiotics industrial society would deal with like a major epidemic. And the big irony in light of current events is that I started this way before COVID was
Ah,
even a
okay.
thing.
Right.
And I mean, that's probably the elephant in the room with regards to this book. And I get a lot of questions about it. It's like, did the current real actual pandemic
Mm.
going on right now advise this at all? And it's like, it's tricky because I certainly have a lot of materials that I could be drawing from, but I had a lot of plans on what it would look like before, and I don't think that I want to adapt it to be a story about that. But that's not to say that I'm not going to take any little references or ideas from our current state of affairs because, they do have a lot of resonance there. One of the main sources of reference that I've been using for it is the Spanish flu outbreak of
Ah, right. Yep.
1918.
Mm-hmm.
That's been really good for reference, and then a lot of other sort of historical points. the idea in the story is it's an alternate timeline London where the Second World War didn't happen, and instead they have plague.
There you go. Well, want to switch gears slightly and talk about your creative process. Is there a way, like you talked a bit about drainers, and I'm wondering if there's any way you could sort of talk through how you go from initial thought to the final finished page. I wonder if there's a step process that you go through.
I think you asked my favorite question. I kind of dig talking about this process. So, okay, where to start on this? Okay, so the story starts as sort of, like nebulous ideas in my head, and those are kind of just like the widest sort of macro view of the entire thing. It's like, okay, it's going to start like this. Some of these things are going to happen in the middle-ish, and then it's going to end like this. And I will make notes on general and specific things. Like I have a very haphazard Word document that I just throw ideas into sort of willy-nilly. Any kind of major story beats I want to hit, any themes that I want to be cognizant of, specific dialogues that maybe appear fully formed in my mind that I don't want to forget about. And it's not exactly a roadmap as much as a sort of like general reference. And so from that, I move on to the sort of first, I suppose you could call it the first step of like page production, which is thumbnailing. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I find this a very invaluable process. And the way I've refined it down to how it works now in Purifier is I have a digital spread of 2 pages. So the book will appear being read. And I will use a combination of photographs and hand-drawn roughs to block out panels and compositions and so forth. And I'll chop and paste together things that I need, like, a little bit of this building, a little bit of that building, this expression with, on this body. And one of the most valuable things that I do at this point is I write and align the dialogue so I can plan the compositions with adequate space for the word balloons and the dialogue therein, because that's a problem that I given to understand that some artists really, really suffer from. The example that jumps to mind is Winsor McKay, who is a marvelous artist and just a terrible letterer. Like, you'd see these pages where like the letters would spill up the side of the board balloon and just like start going on a journey of their own. But yeah, being able to pre-plan like this means that I can decide in advance where I need to leave empty space or just like background details that are inconsequential. So I'm not drawing a lot of detail where it's just going to get covered up. And I also have like plenty of breathing room where dialogue is going to go. And that dialogue gets tweaked and refined at every step after that. But the general sort of, what people are going to say and when goes in there. So what I'll do with those is I'll print them off size as. They're quite low resolution because they don't need to be very detailed. And I will partially trace them, the photographs especially. So this is a very interesting, maybe, I don't know if it's an unorthodox approach, but there's tracing and then there's tracing. And for the longest time, I, like a lot of people, was convinced that, tracing's cheating, right? It's like, well, not exactly. It depends on how you do it. It's like if you replicate someone else's work, especially, like, and just carbon copy it, yeah, that's cheating and you're stealing. But what I've arrived at is a sort of almost like a hybrid process where I won't even just like trace individual lines. I'll mostly just mark out, especially on buildings, the sort of where they are compositionally and some of the major geometry of it. And then I will reverse engineer the perspective from that tracing and then redraw by hand all of the perspective. Because what can happen if you really slavishly trace something, you can really tell that it's being traced off of a picture, and that doesn't look good.
I perceive that you're a more traditional artist than digital. Is that the way it goes, or is there a mixture of both?
I'm a hybrid artist.
Mm-hmm.
The ratio of what I do digitally and what I do traditionally changes, but I think there's strengths and kind of there's benefits to both, and I don't swear allegiance to one or the other because I think that's ridiculous. That having been said, I do, as far as like the bulk of my work, I do prefer working traditionally, but digital permits a lot of really remarkable power, and when it's utilized well, it can achieve things that traditional can't, and vice versa. So I tend to use digital for certain things and not certain other things. So for example, I do lettering digitally, I do cleanup digitally, I do sort of like book layout, obviously digitally, everybody does that. And I do these thumbnails and like compositions digitally, because one of the big benefits of doing it that way is that I can freely rearrange panels and compositions and dialogue as much as I want without like tearing up a page and either like cutting and pasting it or erasing it to death. You get a lot of freedom there, like the ability to sort of go back on what you just did is very well realized and well utilized in the digital space for doing those kind of like pre-compositions and like pre-planning stuff.
Cool. Now, you've talked about Purifier, which I know is taking up a fair chunk of your time, but do you have any other projects planned for the future that you can talk about?
Just ideas. Like, there's nothing that I've set in stone, probably for a good reason. Like, I do want to remain focused on completing the one that's current at hand without, sidetracking myself too much. Because I don't trust my attention span to stray too far, and I need to like keep control of that.
Sure.
So as far as like big ideas, like this will be my next book, I can't say for sure, but I have a lot of different ideas and themes that I want to visit. Like there's like sci-fi stuff that I really dig. There's sort of low fantasy, maybe medium fantasy settings that I'd like to visit, particularly like non-Tolkien fantasy, if you follow.
Right.
It's like when people think fantasy, they think it's like, orcs and, elves and goblins and magic and stuff. And it's like, kinda. One of my favorite sort of like fantasy books was by one of the artists I mentioned earlier, Masamune Shirow. It was called Orion. And it's very sort of Eastern religion themed magic technology, spacefaring civilization. It's very cool. So I'd like to see more stuff like that, like more original kind of whole cloth stuff.
Cool. So for people who want to find out more about your work and your future projects, where can they find you online?
I spend way too much time on Twitter at Alex Steacy, Steacy. I got to be careful, but we've had no end of trouble with that last name. Also, my Patreon, just patreon.com/Alex Steacy, same thing. Gosh, where else? You can read Purifier at purifiercomic.com.
Well, Alex, those are all the questions I have for you, but I'm wondering if there's something I didn't ask that you'd like to get across in this interview.
If you're an artist that hasn't produced a book yet, just go for it. I am convinced that the worst enemy to getting started is that hesitancy and desire to make it perfect the first time. And it's so important to let that go and just do the stupid thing. And just like charge ahead and, get the first one done. And it will probably not quite meet your expectations in some areas. And it will probably surprise you in others. I think that's the only way to break through that hesitancy and like finally realize the projects of your dreams and like get them extracted from your head and onto the page and into other people's, consciousness. So fill pages.
Thanks to Alex for the chat. You can discover more about Alex on Twitter at Alex Steacy, that's AlexSteacy, and online at patreon.com/Alex Steacy. And thanks to you for listening to the True North Country Comics podcast. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe to and like this podcast on Apple Podcasts, and please leave a good rating. Also check out the TrueNorthCountryComics.com website and follow along on Twitter at TrueNorthComics. Please send your feedback to John at TrueNorthCountryComics.com. Thanks again for listening. Come back soon for another episode. Bye for now. True North Country Comics Podcast is copyright True North Country Comics, copyright 2020.